Welcome to Victor's Children, a podcast from so-called Canada talking socialism from below. My name is David Canfield. I live with my partner and cat in Winnipeg, Manitoba, which is in Treaty 1 territory, the traditional territory of Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. All those of us in the Canadian state who aren't Indigenous need to commit ourselves to the struggle against settler colonialism. Victor's Children is a member of the Harbinger Media Network, a community working to promote left podcasts in Canada. Check out the list of Harbinger podcasts at harbingermedianetwork.com. Donald Trump's now paused threat to impose 25% tariffs on Canadian exports, with 10% on energy, sent shockwaves through society in the Canadian state and was about to set off a tariff war. Whatever happens with this particular tariff threat, it's important to discuss what's been happening and, above all, how the left has responded and should respond. It's February the 8th, 2025, and I'm very happy to have two guests joining me to discuss these important questions. Could you introduce yourselves?
Hi, my name is Mostafa Henaway. I'm a community organizer at the Immigrant Workers Center, but also author of Essential Work, Disposable Workers, Migration, Capitalism, and Class.
I'll just mention for people who don't know that the Immigrant Workers Center is located in Montreal.
Hi, David. Hi, Mostafa. My name is Todd Gordon. I'm based in Toronto. I'm on the editorial board of Midnight Sun mag. I've, along with David, I've written articles on imperialism, fascism, and authoritarianism, and COVID and capital's death drive for both Midnight Sun and Spectre Journal, which Spectre Journal is based in the United States. I'm also the author of Imperialist Canada and Blood of Extraction, Canadian Imperialism in Latin America, which was co-authored with Jeffrey Weber.
Thanks. So to start us off, the question of what is Trump up to? How should we understand what's been happening? What the agenda is coming from Trump?
Well, that's a very good question, and I'll just offer a caveat before I offer a really short, superficial answer, which is we should always be careful when we try to tease out the sort of internal logic of what Donald Trump is doing. However, I do think if you listen to what he's doing or listen to what he's saying, as well as some of his inner circle, including key cabinet members, it seems to me that we need to understand it through the America First policy or slogan, and that involves a rethinking of the American empire's wider role globally, not to end the American empire, obviously, but to reassert its strength, but to do so while recognizing that it can't dominate other powers in the world as it has in the past, like at the height of the American empire. So Marco Rubio, for example, says that the unipolar moment is gone. That was always an exception in the history of empires, and that we're now in a multipolar world, and the American, the way it asserts itself or projects itself has to recognize that. So I think there's some measure of scaling back, and related to that, the flip side of that domestically is I really do think it's an attempt to restore American economic power at home and use tariffs as part of that strategy. I really think that's what's happening here. And I don't think we should necessarily be that surprised that a big target will be China. Canada and Mexico will also be targets, given that a significant chunk of American foreign direct investment and American trade goes to Mexico and Canada, and so that could Canada and Mexico make sense as targets to bring some industry back to the United States.
I mean, I think for me, I don't have much to add to Todd, but I think a big part of this, I mean, especially in terms of Trump's inner circle, is the idea of Monroe 2.0, right? Is consolidating their power over the Western Hemisphere, right? As being part of their understanding that they no longer live in this unipolar moment, right? And I think part of that control, especially with the tariffs, and you hear this from both Besnet, but also Steve Bannon quite a bit. I mean, I think there are other people than Trump to listen to actually understand what Trump is actually is doing, or what policies are coming forth, is that their economic policy is to turn the U.S. is that the borders kind of act like Steve Bannon calls it this, right? The golden door to access the golden market, right? And if that they're going to understand that their role partially as consumer of last resort or all resorts for global capitalism, then we should try to profit off that, or maximize the revenue from that. And I think this is also part of that strategy. And because I think also in terms that they're unclear whether they're actually going to be able to bring fully to reindustrialize the United States. I think there's probably some degree of hesitancy too when they're dealing with the question of inflation, when they're dealing with the question of not having the actual infrastructure to reindustrialize the United States fully. And even I think in previous attempts and throughout Trump 1.0 was that any reshoring or onshoring that took place, there was quite a bit of automation. So there wasn't actually that much job creation for the firms that did end up reshoring back to the United States.
Well, of course, we could talk about Trump a great deal, but and a lot of people have. But I think we should focus more on the political responses within the Canadian state, where we are. And I want to just start with I think, a very helpful post that on February the 3rd, Stefan Kipfer, who's a socialist faculty member at York University, he wrote this, identifying two big camps, if you like, in terms of responses to Trump's move. The first includes people including Daniel Smith from Alberta, François Legault in Quebec, Pierre Poilievre. In Kipfer's words, not only do they placate Trump's anti-migrant border frenzy, but this uses Trump's threat to annex Canada as an opportunity to boost one or the other plank of their projects: corporate libertarian, conspiratorial, patriarchal, anti-trans, or ethno-nationalist. And then the other camp, championed by federal Liberal leadership candidates, along with Ontario Tory Premier Doug Ford, Manitoba Premier Rob Canoe, and others, is, in Kipfer's words, willing to accommodate Trump on many matters, migration, policing, military, but also invites us to join a united Canadian response to Trump's tariffs. Its backers, in his words, want to roll Labour, immigrants, and Indigenous peoples into this response as willing subordinates, and some are willing to join in. He notes, Unifor Local 444, it's in Windsor, agreed to host Ford on the first day of his election campaign. And so it's important to note, as Stefan Kipfer does, that both of these camps are Canadian nationalist responses to the situation. The first, in his words, is proudly subservient to Trumpism. And then the second defends the neoliberal capitalist status quo, including the so-called free trade architecture of the US-Mexico-Canada agreement. It defends that neoliberal capitalist status quo in nationalist terms. And then there's a left liberal version of this second response, which we can see with the so-called Pledge for Canada that was launched by NDP MP Charlie Angus, John Cartwright, who's the chair of the Council of Canadians, and also the former president of the Toronto and York Region Labour Council, the largest labour council in the country. Alex Himmelfarb, former clerk of the Privy Council, who has links to the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, and other people. And this Pledge for Canada proposes, as Kipfer puts it, an alliance of NDPers, Liberals, Labour leaders, Indigenous voices, environmentalists, artists, and individuals with various ruling class connections, past or present. And I can note that two of the last bunch are, in terms of people with ruling class connections, are Lloyd Axworthy and Alan Rock, both former federal Liberal cabinet ministers and university presidents, and believe it or not, former Tory Prime Minister Kim Campbell. But then from the Labour side, Lana Payne, the president of Unifor, signed on, and so did Andrea Babington, the current president of the Toronto and York Region Labour Council. And I think what's really important here is that the approach that's embodied in this Pledge for Canada is much more important than the pledge itself. But this is the kind of approach that most of the left, in the broad sense, has taken in terms of how it's responded across the Canadian state. This idea of a coming together across these various class and partisan lines. So now that we've identified those two big camps in terms of the political responses, I'd like one of you to start off with a response to the response. Like, what would you like to say about this kind of Pledge for Canada version of left-tinged nationalism?
I'll take a start. I mean, for me, the Pledge for Canada and the left liberal response of defending the status quo and sort of this idea that it's inherently progressive because it is, confronting Trump, or it's confronting those that agenda, but maintaining exactly what you said, the status quo. It's not that for workers, for Indigenous people, for communities here, the status quo is indefensible, right? It is. We were actually prior to. I mean, we are still heading down to the same situation electorally here because of this of exactly because of that status quo, right? And we, I mean, this is one of the things that, especially when you think about Unifor and you think about many in the trade union movement, is that 20 years ago we were opposing this very architecture of global capitalism, right? We were opposing trade agreements, the power of capital to cross borders, the power of over our communities and over workers' rights, and that fundamentally our analysis was that that free trade or the globalization of capital was actually going to lead to this very situation that we're in, right? The degradation of labor rights, the precarization of work, the increase of inequality. So the fact that we're out here defending it, I think, or that there is a major section of the left trying to build a position to defend, essentially to defend NAFTA, or a left liberal response to I mean, in a way shows how weakened we've become and how little imagination that, or what we feel that there's actually for real movement that can say that there has to be an entire other possibility outside of this, right? And the unfortunate thing is, I mean, for the right, I don't want to go back to Trump, but for the right wing, they're very much putting out political economic agenda of nationalist populism, right? And we're simply to defend neoliberalism will only further weaken the left, will only further weaken our response. I think it's not, and will further alienate us, right? We need to show I think, a radical position at this moment, and that takes the space to say no. I mean, we're not agreeing with the right in terms. I mean, but we are opposed to free trade. We are opposed to global capitalism. We shouldn't be afraid of that and to take that space again. And I think it's really necessary at the time, because without it, we can't provide any analysis that's relevant to people who are affected by this and who are moving to the right.
Yeah, I think Mostafa makes a number of really good points there. Left nationalism, or nationalism in general, left nationalism in particular, are political dead ends for the left, and very dangerous. It presupposes a common interest between, on the one hand, capital or business, and on the other, working class people, oppressed peoples. That is that the nation trumps class power and class struggle, and that's a really, really problematic position that both misrepresents how our world works, including the Canadian nation itself, because there is no nation that's independent of capitalist class owners, workers, Indigenous peoples, oppressed peoples, and so on. And it also just really can cause some significant political disorientation for people down the line, because the need for struggle at some point is I mean, it's not going to disappear. Whether the leaders sit and break bread with business owners on trade councils, or sign manifestos with them, or whatever it is. Either way, we live in a capitalist society, and the need for struggle is going to always be present. And you tell people now that these people are your allies, and then at some point they're going to need to struggle against these very same people who you're telling are their allies. And so there's a real danger there by politically weakening our movements. And so what's really important to remember is whether we live under a free trade regime, and we should not be defenders of free trade, obviously, or a system of tariffs that protects trade, or whether capitalist investment or Canadian businesses are subsidized by the government, capitalists invest in machinery, land, infrastructure. They sell their commodities, whether it's domestically or internationally in the United States or elsewhere. They do these things to make profit and accumulate more capital in their fight with each other for market share. They're not doing this for the well-being of people or to meet human need, let alone human flourishing. They have a particular agenda driven by market imperatives that they're bound up in. And that interest, that agenda is not ours. And so focusing on the nationality, on the nation, the well-being of the nation, and by definition, I guess, who owns the businesses, as if somehow Canadian ownership is better than American or foreign ownership, or the need to protect Canadian industry, misses the point of what kind of social order, a capitalist social order that we live in, and the consequences that has for workers and the oppressed. And not only do such strategies by Canadian break bread with business leaders, sit on councils and strategize with them how to respond to Trump, not only does that leave power in the hands of capitalists, the same people who have imposed neoliberal restructuring, land dispossession, environmental catastrophe on us for 4 decades, but it also boosts their power. It puts more money in the pockets of capitalists. If we're buying Canadian, we're increasing the profits of our bosses. And like any capitalist, Canadian or otherwise, those profits go to at least a portion to reinvest, to grow their business in competition with each other, build out infrastructure, deploy labor-saving technology to more efficiently exploit workers, and so on. All capitalists do that. And so, and their end game is to make workers more precarious and more vulnerable. Canadian capitalists aren't any different than American capitalists. They're the same thing. Just because they fly a different flag doesn't make them any different. But what I also just want to add here, and I think it's really important to note, is that left nationalists, including again what we're seeing recently, badly misrepresent who controls capital or business interests in Canada. This is an old trope going back 50, 60 years, if not longer. They tell us that Canada is dominated by foreign ownership, largely American. And in this way, working with Canadian business leaders becomes more acceptable because, in the cruder versions of this thesis, Canadian businesses are also victims, in a sense, of foreign ownership. Even in the less crude version, by people who might consider themselves socialists, it's always a short step from left nationalist to just simply nationalist. That's always around the corner from the left nationalist position. So I'll just say it's not true that Canadian capitalism is dominated by foreign owners. And it's easy to find the data on this. You can go to Stats Canada's website and you can see that it's true. U.S. companies own about half of all foreign ownership, foreign assets in Canada, but foreign ownership accounts for less than 15% of the ownership of all business assets in Canada. Right? So less than 15% is foreign ownership. American is half of that 15%. And that's a figure that's been declining for decades in many sectors and in general. And both foreign ownership in general and American ownership specifically of the total operating profits in Canada has also been declining for at least a decade. And American ownership of those operating profits is only 8% in 2022. And the last thing I'll just say here is that not only has Canadian ownership of business interests in Canada grown, contrary to the thesis of the left nationalists, but they always conveniently ignore or play down the role that Canada plays on the world stage. The United States, Canada isn't nearly as strong and powerful as the United States, obviously, but it's worth remembering that Canada is one of the richest countries in the world. Depending on who's doing the measuring, it's somewhere around 9th or 10th measured on GDP as the largest country in the world, and it's the 4th largest for outward foreign direct investment stock. And with as I've written about, considerable consequences for human rights and ecologies around the world, and particularly in the global south. And so it's not foreign owners, it's not Americans that are the immediate threat to Canadian workers and Canadian Indigenous peoples and oppressed Canadians. It's Canadian owners, the same people that union leaders and others are trying to tell us we should sit down and trust right now, and that we can come up with a common strategy. Well, we can't come up with a common strategy with someone who rules over us and whose interests are at their core antithetical to our own, regardless of what Donald Trump or anyone else might do with respect to Canadian business. And we need to see Canadian capital's position in all of this, the debate with Trump and so on, the fight over tariffs, as a kind of internecine class struggle over the spoils of the wealth of the environment and the wealth that labor creates in North America. That's what this is about. And they're trying to pull workers and oppressed peoples in Canada alongside as part of their strategy.
Just to add one quick thing and point to that, I mean, which is part and parcel, because if you take away, I mean, this has already been commented a lot in the mainstream media, which has been in mainstream economists, is that once you take away petrol, we're in a trade deficit with the United States, right? So essentially, our vision of nationalism is simply to defend Canadian colonialism to essentially become a petro state. And the consequences of that, right? And I think that we shouldn't be defending that. If they want to export it all the way to hell, let it tariff all the way out. We should be leaving it in the ground. We shouldn't be having a discussion of defending it from tariffs or not. The discussion is we should be leaving it in the ground. But that's also not part of the discussion as well in this.
If I could just add something very quickly there, David, following on Mostafa's point, not only like they're also clearly like the Canadian state, Liberals and Conservatives, possibly the NDP, and certainly Canadian business are clearly using this as an opportunity to advance an agenda that they've had for a very, very long time. It's not a new agenda, but the agenda of expanding fossil fuels extraction, building out more pipelines to reach non-American markets. That's about like the Coastal GasLink, the Trans Mountain expansion. We're about getting to the West Coast to be able to send oil and natural gas to East Asian markets. And they're talking about that now, and they're talking about, like, the BC NDP government about with respect to critical minerals, essentially reducing environmental oversight and regulations and expediting permitting processes for mining, for oil and gas development. And this is an attack on Indigenous peoples and Indigenous sovereignty, as well as any of us who hope for any chance of limiting the already existent damage of fossil fuels extraction and climate change. And so they're using this as an opportunity to expand a really dangerous agenda, and they're doing it by laying claim to defending the nation, which supposedly all of us have a stake in. But this is their project.
Yeah, I just think I entirely agree with what you both said, and it's just such a disastrous prospect to further subsume the labor movement and the left, which are weak enough as they are, into this camp of backing a particular strategy for Canadian capitalism. So it really, to the extent that this takes hold, is going to make a bad situation even worse. But I do think we have to ask the hard question of why is it so influential, right? What it explains just how big the pull is, and why there haven't been more efforts to try to steer a different direction or propose quite a different response than riding on the coattails of this Pledge for Canada stuff, or playing on Team Canada in a subordinate role. Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, maybe I'll just quickly jump in and on that, if that's okay. So I guess the first thing I would just note, maybe in slightly more optimistic way, David, is to qualify your assessment, and of course you and Mostafa can disagree and tell me where I'm wrong on this, but I just do think it's worth noting that more generally speaking, nationalism and left nationalism in Canada, I think has actually been, certainly been on the decline, or was on the decline since its height in the 1970s and 80s. And there's a few reasons for this. One is the work that people have done, a number of different people have done since the 1970s all the way up into the 2000s, I include myself there, to present this sort of empirical evidence that challenges the idea that Canada is being owned and dominated by foreign and powers in American capitalism in general, and to show that Canada has its own capitalist class that rules this country and has objective interest both at home and abroad. And so I think that's been one important thing to note. At the same time, the decline of left nationalism as a political pole is also due to the more aggressive posture of Canada in the last few decades, particularly around the war on terror on the global stage, including its active participation in the war in Afghanistan. And we saw all sorts of a really grotesque militarized nationalism being promoted by both conservative and liberal governments, as well as the media, kind of chauvinistic politics to defend a more aggressive posture in the world stage, specifically around the Afghanistan war, but around the war on terror more generally, and Canada's participation in the American extraordinary rendition torture program. Also, the growth of Canadian mining companies abroad, and all sorts of terrible things that they were doing, and other industries as well, financed by banking. That's been well documented by a number of people. And also more recently, not more recently, this isn't new, but the support for Israel and its genocidal regime towards Palestinians. And so the last thing, just in terms of kind of pushing back against left nationalist tropes, I think really important was the work of anti-racist migrant rights and anti-colonial movements that have really reframed how people on the left in Canada understand the project, the Canadian project. Okay, having said that, that's my caveat for this. Having said that, obviously we are seeing a rekindling of left nationalism. That's obvious. I will say I think it's different though in some ways. I think it's less of a serious commitment in the way that it was for the left in the 1960s and 80s. We'll see. I may be proven wrong in time, but in the past, like around the new left, the so-called new left, it attracted an intellectual current as well as activists, including in union movements elsewhere, who developed analyses and studies of the supposed foreign control of Canada. It was wrong, as I've suggested, and I think politically unhelpful, but I think it had a more thoroughly articulated politics to it and vision to it. Today, by contrast, I think it's almost more of a default reaction to Trump's threats. That's occurring at a time when the left, particularly the labor movement, remains in some ways historically weak. And obviously, and this isn't true of all activists in the union movement, but for a lot of it, in particular its leadership, lacks a vision and a strategy for building meaningful class power. And it doesn't have a different vision of the future led by working class struggle. So it's kind of like this round right now, it's a pretty ideologically thin politics whose resonance I'm not sure is quite the same as it was 40, 50 years ago. It's not a sort of meaningful or hopeful vision, but a vision, as was stated earlier by Mostafa, of defeatism and compromise, born of a notion that workers need business as leaders of the nation to work with and need to work with business to protect themselves. And it's obviously inspired by Trump and American economic might and its threat to Canadian workers, but that doesn't change at all the mode of its of expression. So I think as an expression, it's a long decay of our labor movement and social democracy, neither of which offer these days much in the way of an alternative vision of the future to that of neoliberalism and business-led society we live in. And of course, social democracy, particularly in its more weaker iterations, such as we see in Canada, it's premised on nationalism of a sort insofar as it accepts the class power of capitalists. And as I've just said, Canada are primarily Canadian, and it accepts the power and authority of the capitalist state, who is closely intertwined in the way it operates with the nation and with its institutions and with capital. So it maybe shouldn't surprise us that in this moment, people are sort of by default drawn, in the absence of a more meaningful, richer vision of possibilities, to the stability of Canadian capitalism and the Canadian state, and the ideological way that gets expressed is through nationalism. And there you tend to see markets and capital as things that are more neutral, rather than systems of class power, even if they're sort of being bent to the interests of one side unfairly or unreasonably and so on. And if that's the case, and you fear that you're going to lose your job or people might lose their jobs, then I think there's a certain logic to nationalism. It's not an inevitable logic, but it's a logic of the moment that we're in right now.
Just to jump in, I mean, I don't disagree with Todd. I mean, I think the only thing I would disagree about, I think for the labor movement, it's not that visceral to the tariffs now. You know, if one were to zoom out, right, like in the negotiations or the renegotiating of NAFTA, you had sections of the labor movement defending NAFTA, right, like and defending their position within it, and particularly Unifor, right? Unifor had demonstrations defending NAFTA, and so obviously I think tied again. I mean, when it's also why it's so influential. I mean, there's to me, it's not only a defeat, but it's also how they view, and this feels like the old broken telephone of me, but like it's how they view class and which sections of the class are fundamental to building a mass movement, and so there's always this gaze of I think from the institutional left to it's auto, it's in Southern Ontario. This is the section of the working class, and particularly the organized working class, that we have to defend, right? And that that is so critical to their left, to their social democratic project. And I think and that nationalism, or that tinge of left nationalism, I think you really see it in the Pledge for Canada. And I mean, I think it's also influential. There is this kind of gut reaction that is happening. I mean, in a closer to home here in Quebec, because you had the tariff threat at the same time where Amazon had closed all of its warehouses, its facilities here in Quebec, so all 7. And the immediate reaction of the boycott Amazon campaign is that all of these issues are very interlinked, right? Forget the role of the Quebec state subsidizing Amazon. Forget the role of the Quebec Caisse de Dépôt being more than $1 billion investor. So all of these, the Quebec government essentially defending Amazon's right to exploit workers. So it's not, and then all of a sudden with the closures and the tariff threat, the first thing, Premier Legault said is like, well, the Canadians won last night and I didn't drink my orange juice, right? Meaning I boycotted Florida for and this is kind of that we all now have this common interest, and if we have this common interest, all of a sudden our economic situation, or especially for workers, I think will improve is something we really got to cut through. But then I think it's and I think there's going to be an urgency soon around that. I mean, the other point in terms of I think why it's influential, because there hasn't been an articulated response that goes against it. It's able to fill the vacuum now in a way that there hasn't been. And I think there's also confusion. I mean, there was a post by Migrant Rights Network, which we're a part of as an organization, but this idea that buy local, buy Canadian, it's migrant workers who grow your food. Less than 24 hours before, the press statement would have read, condemn Canadian agribusiness for its role in exploiting workers, right? So but I think there's a lot of confusion, and I think that the left nationalism also is part of it not maybe an articulated strategy, not yet, that through this kind of left nationalism, we can kind of pull under the rug maybe a disenfranchised working class that will just move further into the right, that we can pull them in with a sort of a left populist nationalist narrative around this. And I think that's why there's such a major push for this kind of narrative, and seeing who's actually doing the pushing of this kind of narrative as well, right?
Yeah, I think that you've both made some very important points, and you know, any idea that somehow this could be a shortcut to blocking working class people from moving to the right is just such a disaster, right? Because in fact, it's just going to play into the dynamic of if to the extent that the left is identified with defending a miserable status quo of neoliberal capitalism, then we've seen this in so many countries. It's just going to create opportunities for forces further to the right to try to channel resentment and frustration with the status quo that people are familiar with. But if it is also ultimately this grows out of the weakness of the working class movement and weakness of the left, this takes us to the question of what's our alternative then? If we want to propose a response to what's going on that's distinctly different than what's on offer from any of those major forces that we've been talking about so far, one of you like just take a stab at beginning to outline some of the key ideas that we want to be putting forward?
I mean, in terms of alternative visions, I mean, I think for me, my caveat is that we need patience at this point, right? I think we really need to see our organizing not in a sort of reaction mode. And I know people are saying, of course, we really need to think about particular defensive struggles. There was an article by Ashley Smith in The Tempest, really kind of this focusing and honing in on particular defensive struggles in the United States, and maybe that's correct in that context. But I think here and there as well, I mean, if we're going to have a project that can, if we're going to be able to have it both in articulation and analysis that can actually not just resist what's happening, but to present a real fight back, then I think there's going to have to be a high degree of patience. I mean, I don't think we can be organizing in that way that a lot of people on the left, we become accustomed to the campaign in 6 months and in 1 year, that we really need to think about a longer term political project and alternative, and that there's going to be windows and opportunities throughout this period, because I think this period is going to be it will be unprecedented what we're living through, right? I think for me the second thing is that we actually, the alternative is we need to put forward a real not an internationalist response, but an internationalist response that can see what's that could be relevant to that's relevant to actual working people. And I think in a way and that undermines the racism, that undermines the xenophobia, that undermines a lot of the political arguments and the kind of the narratives that are being put forward. So for example, in the way the anti-migrant politics, the anti-trans politics have become Trojan horses for essentially what is simply further control and dominance by a section of the ruling class in the United States, right? Had nothing to do with and so I think how do we make those solidarities again, and how do we break down, or how do we challenge that, I think it's going to be a lot of work, but we can't go around, and we can't, sorry, how to articulate this in a better way, but in some ways, simply by saying, well, that's a really complicated issue. Some sections of the left, well, we can't talk about open borders. It's a very complicated issue. We can't talk about regularization. That's very complicated. Look at the political moment we're in. We should be ignoring, anti-trans politics now. Look at the moment we're in. We have to become extremely economistic in our thinking and our outlook. As a response is a big shortcut. I mean, in not only is it not a shortcut, it presents a false sort of narrative that isn't actually accurate about what's taking place. And so, to me, I think one of the issues is how do we begin to challenge, the alternative is that, real freedom, real liberation, real dignity for all working class people, while really honing in on not the rights of capital at this moment, right? That you have the freedom of movement for capital, but you don't for people, to me is one of the big issues. And I think the other alternative also, that this idea that in the moment that we're in, and I think there is a section on the left, and this isn't maybe so much about, it is class politics, but in another way, is that that this new right represents a less aggressive imperialism, right? That it's going to be that their political project isn't imperialism in the way that was seen before. And I think we have to really also cut against that there might be a different calculation, or there's debates, or they have different strategies within that, but their end project is the same. And I think that is sort of this debate about the bigger world that we're living in is becoming really, really, I think, fundamental. And I think that the alternative is, to me, and going back, the alternative is that we need to put out a bigger narrative of the world that we live in the moment that we live in, not just simply a reactionary one, right? That we don't want a world with war, right? We don't want a world where communities are gutted of their means of production, their factories, their workplaces. We don't want a world where where people are left without any dignity, without homes, without the possibility of having a decent livelihood. And so I think we really need to start with the really bigger narrative, but that's connected on the ground, right? And how those two things can connect together, because I think people are hungry for an alternative as well. I think this is part of it, and I'm sorry this was really long-winded to get there, but I think people are really hungry for an alternative right now. People are really hungry for a politics that speaks to them. I don't think the narrative of this populist right at all is appealing. I don't even think to the people that are listening to it is appealing, but it's the fact that it exists, I think, is what's important. And I think and Naomi Klein is right about this. The alternative is, I think we need to be bold with our politics right now, and not shy to speak to people. I'll leave it at that. I'll let Todd jump in.
Or maybe before Todd jumps in, I just want to bring something into the discussion, which is, I remember states me, but back during the campaigns against the North American Free Trade Agreement in the early 90s, some of the best attempts to build some kind of an internationalist response to the NAFTA agenda was done around with slogans like solidarity, not competition, right? And so I think reviving the best of that, solidarity across borders, solidarity, within the Canadian state, solidarity with U.S. and Mexican workers, that has to be a starting point, and to make it really clear that our alternative is not a project for managing Canadian capitalism, right? That we do not want people to respond to the current situation by getting on board with the so-called Team Canada, by tying ourselves to that for all the reasons that you've already talked about. Todd?
Yeah, I think those are some really good points, and I think Mostafa is right that people may seem drawn to nationalism now and the idea of like participating with our business leaders in managing Canadian capitalism. Although, obviously, whatever the union leaders may think of their role right now, they're not doing that. They're at the table, but they're just at the table. They don't have power. They might like to think that they have and tell their members that they do, but they don't. They're not ultimately the owners of Canadian capitalism. But I think that while people may seem drawn to this now, they're drawn to it in a context, to the extent that they are, I don't want to overstate that, but they're drawn to it in a context where there hasn't been an effort to build an alternative vision and a organized collective response based on a coherent kind of set of demands that charts out like a different kind of horizon that's not about like working with Canadian business leaders. And so I think that, well, it's definitely true that this isn't going to happen overnight. I think Mostafa makes a good point about needing to be patient about it. I think nevertheless, we do need to be able to develop and articulate an alternative political and economic vision. And I'm not just talking about like raising the red flag and saying the answer is socialism. Obviously, I think that, but that's not where we're at right now. But like what are the kinds of demands that break from the idea that we should tether ourselves to business interests and defend the nation, that break from that vision and do what you just described in terms of that slogan from the fight against NAFTA, like solidarity, not competition. I think you said it was. What are the visions? What are some kind of the demands? And I mean, I've thought like there's definitely things that come immediately to mind that I think could provide a reasonable way of like having conversations with people and getting them to think about the possibility of a different like approach to the instability of Canadian capitalism right now, and something that will like more fundamentally meet their needs. That's not being spoken to them about by the union leaders or by the NDP at all, as far as I can tell right now, or certainly not by most union leaders. And so this, and it should go without saying that this has to start from seeing our interests and our struggles and our organizations of working class people and oppressed peoples and so on as have to be separate from us and independent from business. We can't be sitting at the table with our exploiters and our oppressors. The world that they want, the status quo that they want, isn't the world that we, not only, it's not the world that we want, it's not the world that we need, it's not the world that's going to bring an end to precarity, dispossession, and inequality, nor will it bring ecological sustainability and human fulfillment. That's just not the world that we'll get by working with them. And so, again, recognizing the point that Mostafa made about like, it's not something like we have to be patient around this, but I do think like if we started raising issues or demands in a collective way as part of a strategy to build around things like rebuilding a much more robust welfare state that includes much better support for unemployed workers, not just temporary measures like we saw through the pandemic, in which some people are mooting right now in the face of tariffs, but a genuine rebuilding of support for unemployed workers, national housing strategy, which is so desperately needed, involving, I think we should demand expedited construction of non-market housing for people. We should be demanding expanded, affordable, efficient public infrastructure. Things that are like, these things are in crisis mode right now. Working class people are living that, and they know that. But they're not being given a different kind of vision. They're being given market solutions that are non-solutions and totally inadequate proposals around infrastructure development, particularly around public transit. I think we oppose free trade. We should be opposing the kinds of property rights for capitalists that were established through free trade. We should absolutely be opposing those things, calling for an end to them. Of course, we should be demanding a national project around renewable energies and a green transition that involves public ownership, both of energy companies and the financing of energy companies. And worker retraining to support people who will lose their jobs when we transition from fossil fuels in a serious way, as well as public sector support for employment in more kind of socially meaningful employment, like caregiving work. There's a crisis in healthcare due to decades of chronic underfunding. And that these things should be paid for by much more higher taxes on the wealthy and on corporations, and that precludes them from moving their money to tax havens. It's grotesque the amount of money that they avoid paying in taxes, but they should be paying more than nominally what they're paying now. Also, this has to involve, and I haven't seen any of this around the Team Canada stuff, obviously, or around the whatever the kind of slightly left variation of that document that was signed by a bunch of people that you listed earlier, David, meaningful reconciliation based on nation-to-nation relations with Indigenous peoples. And so that's got to be part of the campaign, as well as stronger migrant rights, good enough to work, good enough to stay, regularization programs. And so these things, they may seem distant, but they seem distant in the sense that they're not being proposed. And there's not a real coordinated campaign and struggle around these things. And, this isn't going to come from our leaders at present, or not most leaders of the union movement. It's going to have to come from rank and file workers and those people who are rooted in movements, union movement and environmental anti-colonial movements. It's going to have to come from there, but it's going to have to be a more collective vision in a way that maybe we haven't seen in the kind of in some time, but with a clearly articulated kind of medium-term kind of just strategy to pivot around. And I'll just say, lastly here, it's also so telling that none of the Buy Canadian advocates, the union leaders who are sitting at the table breaking bread with business leaders, the NDP, none of them that I've seen have talked about the necessity of building greater solidarity with Mexican and American workers, which is just, again, a really sharp reminder of how nationalism limits the scopes of our political vision. It really flattens our understanding of the world and the sense of what's possible. We need to remember, American and Mexican workers sweat on the supply chains that Canadian workers sweat on. They struggle and hope for a different future, and they've been pummeled like Canadian workers have for 4 decades of neoliberalism and austerity and so on. Do our union leaders really think that Canadian workers have more in common with Galen Weston than they do with a Mexican or American worker? And I'm not going to pretend like I have an easy answer about how that cross-border international solidarity can be built, but I do think it's imperative that is part of our vision, because it also will break it really at its core. Thinking that way challenges the nationalist, the kind of left nationalist premise.
Just because we're moving towards the end of our conversation, I want to just wrap up with asking the question of whether you have any ideas about how we can build support for this kind of an internationalist working class response. Baby steps.
Well, I think baby steps, but I think internationalism and the bigger politics is, maybe I walk back on my own answer before. It's at the door. It's not going to look the same as it did, and Todd is right. It's not going to look as the same as it did during the anti-globalization movement, nor should it, right? We live in a different moment. But I think, in agreeing with Todd, we should take the best from that, right? We should, I think there's a lot of hostility to the kind of internationalism, or maybe I'm wrong, and maybe someone say I'm wrong, but there's kind of let's not look at anything positive that came out in those years, and whether it be the late 90s, sort of the anti-FTA organizing, and that we had moved on politically as the left. But the best from that, internationalism was really at the core, right? It was, when talking about the labor organizing, at the demonstrations against the FTA, there was unions from across the Americas, right, trying to build a common agenda, right? There was, peasants movements from across the Americas trying to build a common agenda, right? There was, migrant justice organizers, to local anti-poverty organizers, and the idea that, and one of the things is that, for capital, it's not going to remain national, right? It's always going to be wherever they can find profit, or wherever they can secure their profitability, or wherever they can ensure that their profits won't be taxed, in terms of capital flight, right? Like we can't fight this on the national scale. And I think, one thing that made it easier, and obviously the critique of the anti-globalization movement, was that there was kind of the object of organizing against the summit, was a very easy model in some respects. Of course, there was a lot of organizing, a lot of work, a lot of, in a period where digital tools were not to the same level. People were writing emails on Pine. Not many organizers had cell phones. But these were international mobilizations and international networks that were being built. So I think, to me, supporting that internationalism is not going to be, maybe we're not focusing on these large summits and trying to shut down these summits as the key focal point or the key focal strategy, but simply a kind of a rebirth of internationalism, which I think is beginning to take place, right? Because what they're doing is building a nationalist international, right? I mean, it's one of the only few things Yanis Varoufakis said that I'm like, okay, that actually kind of works. And so our internationalism, I think there's going to be, we will still have to find the concrete, expressions of that. But I think it's also going to mean, one, people are looking at bigger politics, right? No one's talking about the local bank or the local expropriator, right? People are talking about a genocide in Gaza committed by the Israeli state, supported by our party. People are talking about the ways in which the tariffs are affecting our economy or the region. In the front of everyone's mind is those bigger politics, is internationalism. But I think the common expression will be how to extend out, some of those demands that Todd was talking about, but across borders, right? How are we beginning to think about what would a workers' declaration in the Americas against a tariff or a nationalist agenda look like, right? Clear on the agenda for the Americas is, is there going to be intervention in Mexico and in Venezuela? There's, Steve Bannon's already talking about, getting Brazil to pull out of BRICS or Bolisario, and then, and then our response, or the left nationalist response, is going to be a kind of a NIMBY politics where, to me, if we can do it on the ground again, and one of the best things about that period that should not be overestimated was that, worker to worker solidarity tours that were so foundational, right? We over rely on our digital tools, I think. And so there's one aspect in terms of supporting that internationalism. Are we bringing unionists from Mexico to say the reality is that, you know, this is what it's like in the auto plants. This is what it means. This is our shared or common experience or employer, right? And this is that exploitation, right? And I think beginning to rebuild that and rebuilding a broader, maybe some of it will be slogans like, you know, people before profit or, you know, solidarity across borders, but some of it could actually be concrete. And I think more concrete agendas around a green transition, right? Or around an employment pledge, or around breaking the debt, right? I mean, the response even from the left nationalists is like, you know, we're going to secure our border, right? We're going to secure our border. No one is discussing what Canada's role in Haiti is, or what Canada's role in the Americas is, that's causing migration, right? There's no discussion of the root causes of migration, both in the nationalist discourse, the left nationalist discourse, nor the right. And so I think this is part of that radical alternative in internationalism, right? Is that, you know, getting at the root of it, that people are fleeing Haiti because we've just, you know, our states have bankrupted it, have occupied it, and have laid it to ruin, right? And that's case over case over case. And so that in a lot of these things, to support that internationalism, I think will be trying to create physical spaces again. And that might look different from what did in the anti-globalization movement. But it also becomes imperative in terms of building that larger narrative, right? So, you know, alternatives to the World Social Forum that could be more planned out. But I think, you know, we're going to have to be, you know, organizing in a way that we're really that's going to have to go beyond the local. And I think so. Your point, I think, is really, really necessary, because I think it's not just about countering nationalism at this point. If we can't build a new kind of internationalism, a new kind of shared project, a new kind of shared movement, I think it will limit the hope that kind of exists within those moments and movements, right? And I think there is that urge, right? I mean, the Palestine solidarity movement over the last 15 months is an example of that, right? Or is the latest expression of that, right? And of that kind of internationalism. But how do we begin to broaden that out in a way that can speak to these other issues and to this moment? And I don't think it should be bred on the shoulders of the Palestine solidarity movement. But we need those larger space. I mean, there's no clear-cut answer, but we need to figure out, you know, a way that can bring in those local movements and begin to connect them in a much more radical way and non-institutional way, with other movements across borders, because we've really, you know, when I first got involved in the left, that's what changed me forever, right? It was, you know, I might have been involved in student politics or student activism, you know, at York University, but, you know, going to Washington, D.C. and seeing that you were part of something larger against the World Bank, I think changed my life forever. And I think that we kind of have a responsibility to create that context again for a new generation of activists.
I think that's a great point to leave it on. I want to thank you both, Mostafa and Todd, for beginning a discussion about these really important issues. Obviously, we were not going to come up with any solutions, but we have to begin to start having these discussions on the left in terms of how the left is responding and how it should respond to the particular situation that we've been put in. So thanks again. And I should also just draw people's attention in the show notes. You'll find a link to a new article by Todd Gordon in Midnight Sun that is about some of these questions. Thanks to both of you.
Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye. Bye, Todd. Bye, David.
That's it for this episode of Victor's Children. I'd like to thank Jonathan Croker, the producer of Victor's Children, without whom the podcast wouldn't be possible. I'd also like to thank Posey Legg, who designed the graphic for Victor's Children. If you found the episode worth listening to, please do tell other people about the show, since word-of-mouth recommendations are especially helpful. If you don't subscribe through your preferred podcast app, please do. And while you're there, please give the show a high rating. It helps to promote us. If you have a suggestion for an episode or some other kind of constructive feedback, feel free to be in touch with me. You can contact me through victorschildren@gmail.com.